Convidamos, então, para a mesa, como debatedor, o professor do Departamento de Economia da PUC São Paulo e diretor da Insigne Consultoria Econômica e presidente da Associação Nacional dos Cursos de Graduação em Ciências Econômicas, professor Rubens Rogério Savaia. E para a palestra magna desse encontro, convidamos para a mesa o professor Dr. Andrew John Meerman, da University of the West of England. Para mediar o debate, passamos a palavra ao presidente do Corecon Minas, economista Antônio de Pádua Ubirajara e Silva.
Boa noite ao palestrante, ao debatedor. Gostaria de imediato passar a palavra para o Dr. Andrew Meerman, que fará a sua apresentação.
May I first apologize to you. I'm not addressing you in Portuguese. I sincerely apologize for that. And I should apologise. I'm not even apologising to you in Portuguese. So this is very bad. So this one? This one doesn't work. Okay. So yes, let me thank the organisers for this invitation. It was impossible to refuse when it was offered to me. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. And I should thank the organisers for the financial support they've given me to allow me to be here. I feel very fortunate to be in Brazil. This is my first trip. Clearly, Brazil is a crucial country in the world. It's an economic powerhouse. It's providing a model of how to develop, although it does have some problems and challenges about that. And it's also home to the world's most significant ecosystem. So it has so much importance in the world. It's a great time to be here. What happens in Brazil now matters for the world. So I'm really pleased to be here in Brazil right now. The timing could only have been better if it had been 6 months earlier during the World Cup. Although, yes, you can finish that sentence for me, right? What I should say as well is that I've only been here a day and I've already learned a lot about how economics is done in Brazil, both through associations like this and also in the universities. So, although I'm here to talk to you, I'm also here to learn from you. Okay, so the title of my lecture today is the one over there. There is an alternative, at least one. And what the talk is going to do is focus mainly on arguments for pluralism, and particularly in the design of the curriculum. Programs of economics teaching which have more than one perspective in them. This is a cause for which I've been writing for some time. My first publication in 2001 was on this topic, and I've written on it a number of times since then. I've also done this through different memberships of different groups, including the Association for Heterodox Economics, of which I was the coordinator for three years. And also recently through connections with groups like Rethinking Economics and the Curriculum Reform Group headed by Lord Robert Skidelsky, the biographer of Keynes. I am also a member of the Royal Economic Society, the bastion of mainstream economics in the UK. And I was until recently a member of the Committee for Heads of University Departments in Economics. I ran my own economics group for 3 years, and now I'm going to head our economics research centre called Bristol Economic Analysis. Both of these groups are intentionally pluralist, And the curriculum that we've designed for our students is also intentionally critical and intentionally pluralist. So that's my background. Okay. What I'm going to say, what I argue, is that there is something of a crisis in the discipline of economics. This crisis is something to do with ethics, something to do with credibility, something to do with popularity. Given time constraints, this argument is going to be brief, but I'll hopefully make the main points. The problems in economics can be found in theory, in method, and also, and the thing that I'm going to focus on, the approach to teaching. I'm going to argue that all of these problems can be addressed via greater pluralism. Okay, so what I'll cover is these topics. A very brief discussion of the state of discipline, some concerns about that, how some existing alternatives can help address these concerns, think a little bit about pluralism in method, focus on pluralism in teaching, but also to consider some of the realities that we all face if we're pushing this kind of argument. Okay, so what we're asking really is, what is the state of economics? What's the health? Now, I've already confessed that I'm a heterodox economist, so it would be easy for me to criticise mainstream economics as a discipline, so that it's got many flaws. But, you know, I do that. However, clearly there are lots of good things about it. It relates to many other disciplines. It has drawn extensively on a number of other disciplines, including physics and biology, and more recently on psychology. The branch of economics, behavioural economics, draws extensively on psychology. And these things should be applauded. Economics is not closed to new ideas. And indeed, many economists argue that economics in itself is very sound. It just needs to draw more extensively on other disciplines. The other thing you can say about it is that it has applied itself to other disciplines. It now examines all kinds of areas, such as the household, war, health, even things like sex. So these are good developments in the discipline. Clearly as well, as was already mentioned, economics does have some prestige in economic policy. In the UK, the Government Economic Service is growing. It's the largest single employer of economists in the UK. And economics continues to shape political debates all the time. Arguably as well, the public has a great deal of economic literacy. People talk about economics, and they talk about it mainly in sensible ways. So this is good. Also, after a crisis of student recruitment in the 1980s, at least in the United States and the United Kingdom, student recruitment has picked up. Economics is now more popular. I think this is possibly something to do with the crisis. Students wanted to know, what is going on? Why am I unemployed, for instance? So, and economics for economics graduates is also good. Economics still gives graduates a graduate premium, a salary premium. Okay? So, if we say, what is the state of economics? There are lots of good things that we can say. But there are some problems. One, there's a sort of perceived arrogance of economists in some quarters. So people from other disciplines often struggle to work with economists because they think that economists think that they know everything. I don't know whether this is true, but this is the perception that I often hear. We also see things like the statement up there by Blanchard in 2008 saying confidently that the state of macroeconomics is good. Now, I would venture to say that he was proved somewhat wrong by events. I can't help be reminded of the statement by Lord Kelvin, the physicist in 1900, who said very confidently, There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. He was very wrong as well. There are also some issues of ethics. I was going to show you a video clip, but in interest of time I won't. But it's a video of a British TV journalist called Paul Mason standing outside the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, basically shouting at their windows, saying, you know, why are we here again, hearing about another scandal? It's well worth watching this clip. And the film Inside Job, which many of you may have seen, directly implicated academic economists in particular in some of the problems that emerged in the late part of that decade. So there are issues of ethics. And I would argue that that's partly a result of the fact that in economics teaching, ethics is ignored. Or even more, that ethics is something that we shouldn't consider. It's not part of our jobs to consider ethics. It's over there. It's normative. We don't do normative. Now, I think one of the consequences of this is some of the problems that we saw in terms of economics practice. We've also seen some student protests about the economics teaching that they receive. I'll come back to this. And I'll also come back to the issue of student employability. The other question of credibility is whether economics is good at explaining and dealing with economic problems. In some cases, you could argue that it is. In other cases, you could argue that it's not. A famous incident a few years ago was when the Queen, that's her, she went to open a building at the London School of Economics, and this was meant to be a wonderful triumphant event. But of course it went wrong, because the Queen rather inconveniently asked, that's her again on the left, she asked the economists, why did no one see the crisis coming? And this is the Royal Economic Society, okay? So when the Queen says to the Royal Economic Society, well, you know, come on guys, what's going on? This is somewhat embarrassing. And there was embarrassment about this. Okay, I won't go into details of how I see a theoretical mainstream. I also should say that I think a mainstream is difficult to define. What I would say is I think there are certain things that have been ignored, or at least relatively ignored, by that mainstream, and yet are important. I think gender and race have been relatively ignored by the mainstream. It's there is literature, but I think it's explained away in terms of marginal productivity, and let's not worry about things like that. Although we did hear earlier about the impact of the Piketty book about inequality, and even though there is literature, for instance, by Anthony Atkinson, Amartya Sen, I think the topic of inequality, again, has been relatively ignored. And again, it's been explained away in terms of marginal productivity theory. And other factors which generate inequality have been relatively ignored. I think the consequences of inequality have also been ignored. Linked to that, mainstream economics clearly has a limited sense of power. It does acknowledge market power, labour market power, but in a broader sense of power, for instance, relation between capital and labour, or between men and women. There's very little consideration of this. Ecology, there is lots of literature in economics about ecology, but most of it, simply in my opinion, tries to force ecology through a mainstream lens. Everything has to be valued in terms of subjective utility, everything has to be modelled mathematically. All of these things conform to a mainstream method. So I think this is a problem. Probably the most disturbing absence from mainstream theory, until at least the last few years, or relative absence, was banks. and finance. The leading text on the new consensus macroeconomics by Woodford contain almost no reference to banks and to finance. This seems extraordinary when we can see the reality of how the economy works. I'd also argue that the treatment of money in these books is limited. For instance, the concept of shadow banking has not been in the literature. And indeed, I think the concept of financialization more broadly has not really been in the literature. So shadow banking, just very briefly, defined by Bernanke as this. Shadow banking about a diverse set of institutions and markets which carry out traditional banking functions, but do so outside or in ways only loosely linked to the traditional system of regulated depository institutions. So this kind of activity is going on, but it's not really captured in the models. One of my colleagues, Daniela Gabor, is doing a lot of work on this. What do we mean by financialization? Epstein defines that as the increasing importance of financial markets and the creation of more and more financial products and marketization of those products. There's Leeds University, there is a project funded by the European Union called FESUD, F-E-S-S-U-D, and the F stands for financialization. So again, there is work going on, but this is outside the theoretical mainstream. This work is all being done by what might be called post-Keynesian economists or Marxist economists. Another example is modern monetary theory. This draws upon work of various economists. Minsky, somebody that not many people talked about before 2008, and all of a sudden, even the Bank of England talking about Minsky. So this is neglected work, but it was going on behind the scenes, but outside the mainstream. And it's led to new work by particularly Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, first two in Kansas City, and Bill Mitchell and his group in Australia. Key principle of modern monetary theory is that money issuing governments can never go bankrupt. They just print more and they get their money back in tax revenues. This is also often associated with employer of last resort programs. The government directly employs people to solve short-run problems of unemployment. So again, lots of work going on out there, but outside the mainstream. Okay? Arguably as well, there's still room for value theory to be done. Mainstream work is mainly or definitely based clearly on a subjective utility theory of value, and this has certain benefits, but there are other types of valuation or other value theories out there which might be called objective. These could also be useful in valuing things such as nature or health. There's been a lot of activity about well-being and happiness, but this literature is quite flawed, in my opinion, because it ignores the objective conditions under which people live. People can be quite happy, but in a very poor job and have very little income. But they've adjusted to their circumstances, so they report happiness. They report being happy. This is highly flawed, in my opinion. Gender, another issue, another area where lots of work has been going on in feminist economics. For instance, they talk about the language of economics, a gendered language. For instance, the use of the term hard science. Very interesting set of work on gender budgeting, which is a process of understanding budgets in a gender-sensitive way, not focused purely on consumption, but also on things like care. Okay? So this work is all going on the fringes of economics. Okay? So what I'm trying to argue is that if you like the mainstream theory, fine, but there's clearly grounds for the inclusion of a much broader range of economic theories, as well as a broader range of disciplinary perspectives. Okay? At the moment, we've very clearly got the influence of other disciplines, but we haven't got the breadth of perspectives within economics. And I think this is a problem. And all of this literature suggests that it might be a problem. Let's imagine that we could incorporate all of those things in a macroeconomics. Okay, fine. But how do we do that? And this leads us into another set of concerns about economics, as it is. The dominant way of incorporating these things into macroeconomics is simply to build more sophisticated macroeconomic models. Now, admittedly, organisations like the Bank of England do use a large macro model, and then they combine that with smaller macro models for regions or sub-regions or markets, specific markets. Okay, but again, the compulsion is to model it. If it moves, model it. But, and we can see that we do need some sort of system-level theorising. If you're interested in ecology, if you're interested in climate science, climate change, the idea of an Earth system theory, viewing the entire world as a system in itself, has merit. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to build a mathematical model out of it. And the problem with mathematical models is, well, 2 points about that I'll say here. Firstly, aggregation problems. The fallacy of composition identified by economists like Keynes and Marx clearly still applies. So these aggregation problems haven't gone away, and yet constructors of macro models typically assume them away. Representative agent models, for instance. Arguably, even more fundamental than that these systems concepts are qualitative. The relations between them are qualitative. And even if they weren't, and even if you could quantify them, that the statistical relations between these things are not really stable. So there are big objections to have about building these more and more sophisticated macro models, or at least insisting that that's what we do. I'm not suggesting we throw out macroeconomic models, but there are other things too. And what this does, this hints at wider criticisms of mainstream methodology. And I haven't got time to go into all of them. I'll just focus on the ones related to the top three. The one on the left says individualist and reductionist. The second one is universalism, or in other words, a lack of context. The desire to generate universal results without taking into account local specificities or historical specificities. And yet, as we know, history matters. Ben Bernanke knows that history matters. That's why when the crisis hit, he knew what to do, because he was a student of the Great Depression. Okay? The one in the top right-hand corner, I'm not sure whether this works. Oh yeah, there we go. It's too small anyway. Is about Tony Lawson, Cambridge economist, has argued over a long period, inspired by a philosophy of critical realism, has argued that mainstream economics has a flawed ontology. It's individualist and reductionist, and it also assumes a particular model of causality, that X causes Y, event X causes Y. Okay? His argument is that that is inappropriate because actually science does not search for these regular associations. It searches for deep causal mechanisms. Okay? Gravitation, for instance, is a classic example. We need to discover, scientists look to discover things like gravity. They don't care whether tennis ball 1 hits tennis ball 2. That's not interesting. What's interesting is gravity. One thing we might need to do is reimagine the economy. What is a good metaphor for the economy? And on the screen there, I don't have time to talk about them now, is a whole range of different possible metaphors for the economy. The one that we most think of is the top left, the equilibrating machine. The economy as an equilibrating machine. The Phillips Phillips curve is something you associate with Phillips, but Phillips also built a machine which moved water around, a hydraulic Keynesianism. This is how we tend to think about the economy, as a machine. But really, is that the best metaphor? Is that what the economy is really like? Or is it actually a heat engine, a perpetual heat engine, as described by Ayres and Waugh? Or is it a complex adaptive system, as discussed by many, many complexity theorists? So, arguably, we need to have a better metaphor than the one we've got, because the one we've got forces into a mechanistic, machine-like thinking, which may not actually capture the workings of the economy that well. And it certainly misses qualitative change, qualitative elements. Here are some elements of complex systems thinking. I won't go through them, but key here are that we're talking about non-equilibrium systems much of the time. These systems will not settle down into equilibrium. They may be stable. They may be stable for sustained periods, but it's not an equilibrium in the same sense that we normally use the term. Also, these systems are clearly they're non-linear. Very odd things can happen in them. Let the financial crisis being one of them. That wasn't a small move away from the equilibrium, which we're going to return back to. This was a massive shift, which was largely unpredicted. Whether it was unpredictable is another thing. All of these arguments about the nature of the object, I've argued, particularly with my colleague Paul Downward, these arguments about the nature of the object, the nature of the economy, necessitate mixed methods. They necessitate a pluralism of method. The ontology of the world that we're looking at is too complex to be reduced to a set of numbers and a set of numbers within a model. We need to take into account qualitative elements. And I don't mean qualitative in the sense of we'll do a survey and ask people to respond 1 to 5 and then we'll put that into an econometric model. That's not what I mean by qualitative. Qualitative means maybe talking to people, asking them what they think about things or why they did things, or observing them in their behaviour. These are the qualitative methods that we really need to get to the causes of things. Statistical methods can be very good at finding associations and identifying patterns, and that is important, but they in themselves do not identify cause. And of course, good statisticians know this. But often we forget that. Some very attractive tunes on phones. This is good. It's progress. Okay, so there's a complex ontology. This necessitates a mixture of methods, a pluralism of method. Does it mean that anything goes? This is a very live issue in ecological economics at the moment. The leading ecological economist called Clive Spash, or a leading economist in that field, Clive Spash, is arguing very strongly that you can't have eclecticism. You can't have anything goes. You need to have some limits on what counts and what doesn't. And he's arguing that actually the mainstream models based upon subjective utility theory and other things, they're wrong. We just get rid of those. And then we'll have pluralism around a narrower set of principles. The other people can get on with their models over there. The ecological economists will get on their models over here. Okay? I'm neither endorsing nor condemning that view, but it's a view that's out there. Spash argues for what Sheila Dow has called structured pluralism. That there are schools within economics. There are schools, they have their own identity, they have their own boundaries, but these boundaries are permeable. And also that these schools are capable of conversing with each other, they're capable of discussing things, they're capable of debating. But they're still all within this thing called economics. And she argues that all of these different schools, for ontological reasons and also for epistemological reasons, they're all necessary. But they're all fallible, they're all capable of being criticised, they're all capable of being wrong. So this is not eclecticism, because she's saying that some schools are really going to be inconsistent with others and they can't be combined with others. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't exist. Okay, so you've got pluralism, but you've got structure. Okay, So far, we've heard lots of things about how to do economics, but the thing that I said I was going to spend most time on, I haven't actually talked about yet, which is about the teaching of economics. Now, you might think that I'm going to argue that because of what we've just seen, teaching economics must be pluralist. Now, I'm not going to say that, because if you said that, then you'd have to link the economics and the teaching of economics directly, and that's not correct in my view. You can be monist, you can be absolutely convinced that your theory of economics is correct. You can be convinced about that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you should teach. Okay? That would be my argument. Similarly, you could be very pluralist about your economics, but you could still, for some reasons, argue that teaching should be one perspective. Okay? So I don't think there's a definite relationship between the economics and the teaching. Now, why do we need to think about teaching economics? Let me just skip forward a little bit. I would argue that the literature on pedagogy and economics is focused entirely on process, not on content, and crucially, not on goals. So I think this is a problem. Most of the innovations in economic literature, most of the innovations in economic teaching are about being more entertaining, being a better lecturer, not standing behind this thing and talking into this microphone because it's less interesting than other things that we could do. Okay? It's been about that kind of innovation. Okay? Also, problems with teaching economics is that in economics, the barriers to working with other disciplines seem to be high. Possibly because of the perception of economists by other disciplines. That's not necessarily economists' fault. And also, there's an issue with the training of economists. I'll just carry on forward. This is a table of findings from a survey done in 2007 of employers of economists. Okay? And what they've asked the employers is, what do you want your graduates to have? And what do they actually have? And this is quite damning in many ways. If we look at the top here, the difference between what is regarded as essential by an employer and what the graduates are actually coming along with is striking in some cases. Okay? So 97% want their graduates to communicate clearly in writing. Only, I can't read it in my glasses. 55%, only 55% say that their graduates have got that skill. Okay? 92% want graduates to communicate clearly in speech, but only whatever that is, again, about 55% are able to do it. Okay? So this is the other problem with the teaching of economics as it currently is. It's not actually helping the students. It's not helping them get jobs because they're being regarded as not very employable. Okay? That's quite interesting. Be objective. The discipline of economics preaches objectivity. We don't do normative. And yet, economics graduates aren't very good at being objective. Economics is a very technical subject, possibly too technical. Does that mean that economics graduates are good at communicating complex concepts? No, they're not. Only 44% are, according to this survey. So this is a problem. This is a series of problems. It's not all bad, but this is possibly the most striking one of all. Abstraction, one of the key skills of the economist. Okay, from day one, the economist is taught to abstract. Employers say yes, we want. 71% of us want our students to be able to abstract. Can our graduates abstract? No, 41% only can do abstraction. So the thing that dominates the discipline, the graduates can't even do that. So there's a problem here, I think. Again, it's not all bad. Graduates are good at building models. They're good at using models. Well, you'd expect that. So something is going right. And surprisingly, this is one that is quite surprising for me, sensitive to social, cultural and political issues. It's not particularly important to employers, 61%, but actually the graduates are not bad at it. Or they're at least as good at it as they are communicating. So for a discipline that I've said doesn't talk to other disciplines and has excluded some of these more other social sciences, economics graduates actually quite good at it. Okay, so earlier I said that I don't think that how you see economics being done is necessarily how you should see economics being taught. And why is that? Well, this is because I think what we've got is the three-headed, I've called it the multifaceted economics teacher, but this is the three-headed economics teacher. If you enjoy Monty Python, you will recognise that image. The three-headed economist. What do the three heads say? Well, one head says, I'm an educator. I'm in the classroom, I'm an educator. Okay, that's one head. But the other head says, but I'm an economist. I have beliefs, I have warranted beliefs about how the economy works. I believe that certain theories are better than others. Okay, so I've got all these things. But the third head as well is that I hold political views. Or I hold beliefs about the world. I hold normative positions on things. So the task for the economics teacher is actually quite difficult because you've got these three heads and they could all well be saying different things. Okay? Now, one way to deal with that is to just pretend that two of them are the same. So what this bubble at the bottom there says is, do not conflate A and B. What that means is that you shouldn't forget that you are an educator and an economist. I think one of the common problems in economics education is that economists think that their job is to teach the students to think how they do. Now, I don't think that is the goal of the economics teacher, or at least it's not the only goal of the economics teacher. Another thing that economists often do is to deny that they hold political views. I'm objective, I'm neutral, I don't have preferences. This, of course, is not true. And the idea that we can completely exclude our preferences from our teaching is silly, really. And the other thing that a teacher has to do is recognise their own power. Now, I believe in this thing called political economy, which recognises the importance of power. Now, you can't acknowledge the importance of power and forget about your own power. Okay? So at the moment, the person with all the power in this room is me. Yeah? You're listening to me politely, and there's nothing you can do. Okay? So I have the power at the moment. And every time you go into a classroom, it's the same. Right? You have the power. Even if you decide to give the students the power, you've decided that. Okay? So you've got to recognise your own power as a teacher. And this is why the goals of the educator are absolutely crucial. Now, I'm going to just present very briefly here three available sets of goals, three goals that an educator could have. The first one here, which I've called intrinsic or liberal, this is the tradition associated with liberal arts in the United States. The goal of going to university is become educated. It's not about training. It's not about learning any particular things. It's about being able to think. Okay? So education is valuable in itself, and the graduates that come out of that education should be critical, and they should be autonomous. They should be able to think for themselves. Okay? This is one set of goals that you might have as an educator. Another set of goals you might have as an educator might be called instrumental goals. You've got much clearer, narrower targets for what you want your graduates to be able to do, or your students to be able to do. So these types of goals are focused on knowledge, specific pieces of knowledge, or on skills, the development of skills. Now, obviously in this room, much of the instruction that goes on, much of the training that goes on, is in the development of these skills, because you're employed, many of you are employed as economists, and you're paid to do certain things, and clearly your employer wants you to do those things. So you do need skills, okay? But the problem I think we have with undergraduate education is that economists, and possibly other subjects too, but economists is our subject here, economists are trying to get their students to learn certain things and to be able to do certain things, but not necessarily think independently or think critically about a particular problem. So, as we saw earlier, economic graduates can build models, they can use models, but they can't necessarily communicate them or necessarily think about them in a critical way. This is a result, I think, of an education that's been too instrumentalist and not put enough value on the liberal goals of simply getting people to be better educated. We're in Brazil, so I should mention the thought of Paulo Freire and the critical pedagogy. And this is particularly focused on the idea of empowering students to understand their own lives and understand what's affecting them at the time. This is a process of what Freire calls consciência. I don't know what that is in Portuguese. I can't say it in English. But it's about making people conscientious. Yeah, see, I can't do it. It's about making people aware. It probably sounds better in Portuguese. But this is in some ways quite instrumental. It's trying to give people, it's giving people specific knowledge about themselves. But the goal of that is to empower them, free them from ideas that they've inherited. Okay, so this is not exhaustive. There are other educational philosophies. This is just three that I've come across, but I find these three quite useful to think about how you educate people. I think these are crucial. These goals are crucial because these goals will largely determine the content of your teaching and also how you go about it. Okay? Or at least they will largely affect the content of your teaching and how you go about it. Even if you've been told very clearly that you have to cover topics 1 to 10, that's the content. There's nothing you can do about the content. Even if you've been told that, how you do it is up to you. You can ensure that people understand the main concepts of neoclassical economics, and that's fine. That's your brief. But you can also get the students to think about those concepts in a critical way. Your goal is not to tell them that those concepts are wrong. It might be that they come out believing those concepts much more strongly than when they started. And as the educator, you have to accept that if you're interested in education. Now, I'm going to argue, as I already just did, that you could achieve all of these goals just by teaching neoclassical economics. It's possible to do that. You can certainly get people to learn the concepts of neoclassical economics, the instrumental goals. You can get people to understand, perhaps, that one of the reasons they're in the position they're in is because of the influence of neoclassical economics on economics and on government. So that would be part of the critical, the empowerment. And also you can spend a lot of time criticising or at least examining the assumptions of neoclassical economics, which would achieve the liberal, the critical, the autonomous goals of liberal education. So you can achieve all of those things just by teaching one perspective. You could. But I would argue that you're going to achieve them better if you take a pluralist approach, and specifically if you throw heterodoxy, different heterodox perspectives at the students. They'll have a much more rounded understanding. They'll be able to compare and contrast different perspectives. They'll understand the weaknesses, if you think there are any, in the mainstream approach. And they'll just be better educated. And they'll probably enjoy it more. And you might think that I'm just making this up or I'm claiming these things as abstract arguments. Well, I partly am. But there is evidence to this. There is evidence to these effects. It's being built. It's taken some time to come, but it is being built. There are lots of case studies out there now which examine pluralist teaching and the effects on the students, and most of them demonstrate fairly positive outcomes. Not all the time, and not for every student, because that would be ignoring context. But there's enough evidence out there that enough students are affected in a positive way by these pluralist curricula to think that it's effective and to think that these educational goals are achievable better with pluralism. And I think you could argue this in theory because teaching one view does various things. It may create unreasonable certainty. If you are already a critical kind of person, you may become demotivated if you're told, no, we're only going to look at one perspective, we're not going to look at others. That can be quickly demotivating. And as we know from education, you have to be motivated, you have to be engaged, otherwise you won't learn anything. It may encourage rote learning without criticism, so you can learn how to do certain things, you can do it over and over and over again, but if you're given a new problem of a slightly different sort, you're unable to deal with that. Okay? But by teaching different perspectives, you might actually learn to think a bit more broadly about a particular problem. On the bottom right-hand corner there, you may not actually challenge the lecturer. The lecturer may have a better time if they're teaching these different perspectives and having debates and seeing the students debate them. It may actually be more enjoyable for them too, as well as the students. We know that students are not happy with many aspects of the economics teaching that they receive. This is a statement from Rethinking Economics. This is a group based in London, but all over the world, or it's growing in its presence. And they say here, what we are looking for is curricula that embody the three pluralisms. Pluralism in methodology, pluralism in schools of thought, and pluralism in disciplines. Okay? So, if you don't believe me, fine. But these students are saying the same thing. One of the things that they carry on to say is that this approach means at least a key role for the history of economic thought in a way that encourages debate over different schools of thought. So they're asking for this pluralism, they're asking for the debate, and they're asking for history of the discipline. Another group is the International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. And they say a similar thing to the Rethinking Economics group. We have no doubt that economics students will profit from exposure to different perspectives and ideas. Pluralism will not only help to enrich your teaching and research and reinvigorate the discipline. More than this, pluralism carries the promise of bringing economics back into the service of society. And again, they ask for theoretical, methodological, and disciplinary pluralism. So, what might a different curriculum look like? Well, I've started off by saying you've got to be clear what you're trying to achieve. And so we need to sort of say what would be the principles underpinning a different type of curriculum. I think it would reflecting this focus on goals, a curriculum would have to reflect education, but also the development of skills. it's all very well developing highly educated students, but they need to be employed, and we need economists. So the skills are necessary. What we need to teach is an interlocking set of concepts. One example of that is that I personally don't like the distinction between macro and micro. I think it's somewhat misleading. If we go back to a complex system, the distinction between micro and macro breaks down, because what happens in the micro level will affect the macro level in utterly unpredictable ways, and then it will also feed back. They're intertwined. And if we think back over the history of the discipline, the classical economists like Smith and Marx didn't have macroeconomics and microeconomics. They just had economics. So we've got an interlocking set of concepts, and they have to be taught as if they are interlocking. They can't be taught as being separate things, right? Today we'll do marginal productivity, and next week they will do macro modelling or something. The curriculum should be more student-centred. What do students want? What do students need? Hand over the power to the students occasionally. Interdisciplinary, we've already mentioned that several times. And I think a crucial part of a new curriculum is that it ought to be focused on solving problems. Why? Because when we go to, and you know this as practicing economists, when you come to solve a concrete problem, it's much harder than doing something in theory. I mean, theory is held up as the high point of the discipline, but really, theory is easy. It's dealing with reality that's the hard thing, and you know that. You know that better than me. I work in a university. Well, I work in a university. Okay, some of you guys are working in government, and that means you're dealing with difficult problems. Okay, so the idea of arranging a curriculum around solving problems will help people prepare for the life outside academia, but also it will force them to be creative and critical about the material that they read. Clearly, I think there ought to be a real-world grounding and some knowledge about the real world. One of the big criticisms about the economics professional, the economics graduates, is that the economists don't understand the real world. And I think this is partly because the economics graduate has been forced through a series of classes on maths, and more maths, and then stats, and then some more stats, and then some more maths. But the world itself is missing. And the other thing I would say, and this is probably the most controversial thing, is to say that these curricula should be pluralist from the very, very first moment. I don't think that we can have pluralism that starts at the end. It's a common argument to say that students get confused if you throw different perspectives at them. This is nonsense. Yes, you may have to be a little careful with how you do that, how you get them to consider different perspectives, but the idea that they can't actually understand them doesn't bear any relation to reality, I think. And in fact, in other disciplines, it's very clear that we say, right, here's one perspective, here's another perspective, right, what do you think about that? From day one. And indeed, even in economics, macroeconomics for a long time was taught about debates. We've got classicals over here, we've got Keynesians over there. They disagree. They've got different assumptions. How do they disagree? So even in economics, we take this pluralism where we want to. But in other places, we say it's too difficult. I don't think it's too difficult. I think we should be pluralist from day one. So, this is a typical UK curriculum. Discussions today have suggested to me that it's probably fairly similar to a typical Brazilian curriculum. I know there are differences. But what we've got here is a block of micro, a block of macro, a block of methods, which really means statistics, a block of maths, and then another block of maths, but I've called it modelling, but essentially it's the same thing. You might have something from another discipline, maybe do some political science, maybe do some sociology. And then you might have special topics, labour economics, monetary economics, kind of thing. And then you might go on a placement. You might go and work for someone for a year. This is quite common in UK degree programs now. And then when you come back, you do advanced micro and advanced macro and advanced statistics and advanced other things. Okay? So this is how the typical curriculum works. I don't think I'm being unfair here. In fact, my own department's curriculum looks quite a lot like that, which I'd like to change really, but I'm no longer in charge. Okay, how might it be different? Well, you could have something like this. So rather than having micro and macro, you've got a block there called the economy. And the economy looks at the economy. And it includes the history of the economy. But that would also allow us to look at the history of the discipline. Okay? Why did Smith start writing about the pin factory? Was it a dream he'd had? I mean, we know Smith was slightly strange. He would walk around and fall down holes. So we know Smith was odd. But he saw things going on and he said, this is significant. I need to write about this. And that's why he was writing about what he wrote at the time. Why did Keynes become so powerful in economics? Well, one of the reasons was because he put together a convincing argument about how to get rid of unemployment, which was the most pressing problem of the day. So there's a very clear link between the history of the discipline and the history of the economy. And I think these two things ought to be put together. Next to that, we've got this thing called developing economic thinking. And this is methods. But this is not just statistics. This is might include the philosophy of economics. If we do statistics, why are we doing statistics? What are the problems with doing statistics? When might it be better not to do statistics? Which philosophical positions are we reflecting when we choose to do statistics? These are all good questions. I think they're all good questions that economics students ought to consider in much more depth. And at present, I don't see them being considered. The next box is similar, becoming the economist. And including this, I think this is it is looking at the practice of the economist. And it's including things like data collection. Now, how many students of economics have actually been taught about data collection or have actually engaged in their own data collection? I fear it's not that high a number. Well, there's one. Good. Okay. Well, that's good. But most of the data that economics students use is secondary data. It's government data. Okay? Now, that's fine. But you shouldn't just accept that data on face value. You should understand where that data's come from, when it was collected, how many people were questioned. These are all really important questions in understanding the data that you've got in front of you. And yet, most of the teaching of methods and statistics in universities doesn't consider these questions. Fourth column over there is called debates in economics. Pluralism from day one. We could start off by debating the minimum wage. What does economic theory tell us about the minimum wage? Lots of things. What does the evidence tell us about the minimum wage? Lots of things. Okay? The theory and the evidence don't answer the question about whether minimum wages are good or not. But that's annoying. But it's also really useful as a student of the subject. Okay? The other box has got other disciplines, again, reflecting the interdisciplinary nature of the subject. But I would say that I would like to see all of the economics boxes also bringing in more of the other disciplines. They're not isolated boxes. The final year, after they've been back from working, they do their own research project. Collect their own data, do something with that data, reflect what they've done. Think about the ethics of what they've done. Have they made up the data like some well-known economists? Have they left out data like some economists have been known to do? I'm not suggesting that this is a widespread problem, but there have been cases, as we know. But there are clear ethical issues about how you collect primary data, and these are very interesting. And they could be extremely valuable for an economics graduate to think about. So I think doing a research project is very important. And then you could specialise in certain topics. If you're really interested in the labour market, great, do some labour economics. If you're really interested in monetary policy, do some monetary economics. Okay, I think there should be opportunities for students to specialise in things that they're particularly interested in. Okay, so there's an alternative framework. It's not that different from the first one, but it's different enough. Okay, I'm going to skip through this, because even though it's interesting. What are the barriers to doing this? I'm aware that some of you might be out there thinking, yes, this all sounds great, but in the context that I'm in, there's no way I could do it. And there are lots of barriers to doing this. So, for instance, in the UK, there is something called the Research Excellence Framework. This is a research assessment exercise. Okay, it attempts to value bits of research. Unfortunately, it only really places value on a couple of types of research. If you hope to get published in the best journals, you need to be doing mathematical modelling or something innovative in econometrics, or do something with a data set that no one's done before. It's fairly narrow. And also, you tend to be working from one set of principles as opposed to a wide range of principles. So this is a problem because it narrows the pool of people able to teach pluralistically. There's a lot of inertia in the discipline. People don't like to change. If you've prepared a course and it's taken you 5 years to get it right, you don't want to have to change it again or rip up your notes. You want to, you've got plenty of other things to do, including doing the research. Textbooks are a real problem. Textbooks are dinosaurs. They lag behind the research in the discipline by an alarming number of years. And of course, once you've got a textbook, you feel like we must stick to the textbook. We can't move away from it. The textbook. Okay. So it's a real constraint on us to have this textbook. MOOCs, massive open online courses. These are a growing thing, and they've been pioneered by some of the biggest universities, particularly in the United States. Why are they a barrier to change? Well, because they enforce the two above it. If you can just pull off all this resource from some free open access resource, brilliant. Okay? I think they're also problematic in other ways, but we can talk about that later. Who is it that's doing PhDs? Who gets to supervise the PhDs? Well, it's the same people publishing in the top journals. And those people aren't necessarily that interested in teaching a variety of economic perspectives. There's also a cultural value placed on formalism. Why is it that economists do so much maths? Well, they may have their own good reasons for doing those things and think it's the best way forward. Fine. But there's clearly also a cultural value placed upon maths. It's associated with science. And this is something that economists don't like to give up. So there's a cultural barrier to getting rid of some of the material that we or the emphasis on the formal material that we currently have. Political. some of the tenets of neoclassical economics are very clearly associated with the politics of neoliberalism. And there will be people that don't want to give up those tenets. CORE stands for Curriculum Open Access Resources in Economics. And I'll talk very quickly about that now. This is a curriculum reform program that was funded by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. You may have heard of it. You can go to the website and you can look at the materials. Okay? It's led by Wendy Carlin from the University College London. In my view, it focuses on the teaching process. It's about making the teaching materials better. Crucially, it's about updating the textbook. This material includes lots of material that you won't find in most textbooks. And for that, it's a good thing. Also, it adds in history. It says, it is important for students to understand history. So again, in that respect, it's a step forward. It's also making much better use of examples, not just teaching people dry theory, but also teaching them in an applied way, in context. This is also a good thing. The slogan for this approach is called Teaching Economics as if the last 3 decades happened. Okay? Now, what this actually means is updating the textbook. Okay? It's about updating the textbook. What it doesn't necessarily do is teach as if the last 3 decades in the economy, or indeed the last 10 years in the economy, have happened. There's little sense of contestation. There's little sense of debate. There's what might be called a Whig history. The history that's in there is there to sort of explain that where we are now is a sort of the end of a natural process. It's a good thing. And also, given what I said earlier, I find that the goals of this approach are quite opaque. They're not clear. It's not actually clear what CORE is trying to achieve, apart from updating the textbook. Okay? So I'm quite sceptical about this, although, as I say, there are certain good things about it. Another mechanism which may prevent change is state regulation of curricula. In the UK, there's something called the Benchmarking Statement for Economics. It's a government guide to the shape of the economics curriculum, and it's currently under review. In some ways, it's fairly benign. It says some fairly neutral things about what economics should be about. In other ways, though, it's quite dogmatic. So this is the statement, and I'll just read the first sentence. It says, economics is the study of the factors that influence income, wealth and well-being. From this, it seeks to inform the design and implementation of economic policy. And it carries on. Now, that's fine. It's okay. So, in that sense, it's fairly benign. Where it looks more dogmatic is if you compare it to other disciplines. Now, if I asked you to name a discipline associated with dogma, you might think theology. Dogma, right? But theology, the description of theology, is actually much less dogmatic than this. And again, I'll just read the first sentence. TRS, which stands for Theology and Religious Studies, is a subject discipline, may be, again, emphasis on may be characterized as a family of methods, disciplines, and fields of study clustered around the investigation both of the phenomena of religions and belief systems in general and of particular religious traditions, texts, practices, societies, art and archaeology. So this is very, very broad, much broader than the economics description. So there's a certain amount of dogma in this document. I would say that it's essentially a training program in mainstream economics, and it certainly doesn't force people to be pluralistic. It doesn't say that you can't be, but it doesn't say that you must be. The goals of the programme are, again, neglected. They're only talked about right at the end. So from my point of view, they've gone about this in the wrong way around. And the most striking thing about the new draft is that so far, it's essentially identical to the one in 2006. Now, I find this striking because I think something happened in 2007, 2008. And I would have imagined that this might have changed what economics was about. But no. So if the Carlin project was teaching economics as if the last 3 decades had happened, this, to me, looks like teaching economics as if the crisis never happened. Okay, so I've been quite negative there in a sense of barriers. How do we actually get change if we want to? We have to be realistic. We have to work within structures that we're in. We're paid by people. I'm paid by somebody. I can't go in there and teach exactly whatever I want. I have to be aware of what I'm expected to teach, and I'm also part of a team, and that team expects me to teach certain things. So there are these constraints that we're under, and we have to work within those. But we can also look to change those structures if we think they're not good enough. And I think the key to doing this is by offering a different vision. I read an article on the plane, on one of my 3 planes, on what day it was, Wednesday. And I read an article about climate change. And the author was saying that if we want people to be convinced about the need to do something about climate change, you need to get people to think in terms of different frames. And the point was that he said limited frames can lead to false debates. If you accept a frame that's very narrow and argue on that narrow basis, you'll probably lose. What you need to do is offer a different frame, a different vision. So, what we need to do if we want to change the curriculum, if we think it's necessary, is change the conversation. Don't ask, how can we deliver this textbook material better? Instead, ask, what is our vision for the graduates that we want to produce? What are we trying to do? How do we imagine our graduates at the end? If you start from that, and I know this because I've done this in my own department, if you start from that, you can end up with a very different curriculum to the conventional one. And you do that by changing the conversation and getting people to think about higher level things, goals. What are we really trying to do? And then, what's the best way of getting to that? Rather than, here's some material, how are we going to do this? Okay? So it's about changing the conversation. So, to sum up, finally, I think there's something of a crisis in economics. I'm not saying it's all wrong or by any means, but I think something of a problem to be dealt with. I've argued that these problems can be addressed by pluralism. In education, I think we need a reform of teaching, content and process, and crucially of goals, and an examination of the goals, because I think that by examining the goals, you will think about teaching in a different way. And then finally, we need to lay out a vision for an alternative economics or an alternative economics curriculum. And there is at least one. Okay, thank you very much.
Convido o professor Rubens Savaia para fazer os seus comentários.
Enquanto ele põe o PowerPoint, antes de mais nada eu gostaria de agradecer o convite. Eu me sinto lisonjeado de participar dessa mesa. Acho extremamente importante o convite feito ao Andrew, certo? Que vem nos trazer o debate, vamos dizer assim, é um debate árduo. Eu tenho acompanhado no exterior, já fui algumas vezes, conversei com ele, já fui algumas vezes no congresso da Associação de Economia Heterodoxa e algumas vezes no congresso de promoção da economia política. né, que tenha ocorrido na Europa, e é muito interessante a gente vê como eles estão nas associações na Europa, muito mais na Europa do que nos Estados Unidos, pensando o pluralismo, principalmente a partir da crise. Também é importante lembrar que, numa reunião do Conselho Federal de Economia, nós fizemos um debate sobre a Carta dos Estudantes, sobre uma das cartas, porque são várias, mas uma das cartas que foi lida aqui, um dos trechos da Carta dos Estudantes, pedindo o pluralismo. Agora, o que eu acho que é mais importante, Cadê o aparelhinho para eu passar os slides? Aí, tá ligado? Não, tá ligado. Você ligou, tá certo. O que é mais importante do debate todo e da formação, eu acho que eu aproveito, é que eu vou ressaltar esse aspecto, né? Muito, se não quase a totalidade, do que o Andrew coloca como proposta, nós temos no Brasil como lei, fruto de um debate de 10 anos recentes, 10 anos, a lei é de 2007, fruto de um debate de 1997 sobre a reforma curricular no Brasil, debate no qual participaram as universidades, a associação, qual eu não sou mais presidente, sou diretor atualmente, mas foi em outubro que eu saí da presidência, a Associação dos Cursos de Graduação em Economia, a ANPEC, o FENECOM, que está sentado aqui, certo? O COFECOM, todos nós, todos economistas profissionais e acadêmicos engajados num debate sobre o currículo de economia no Brasil e o pluralismo. Para nós, Andrew, não é um debate muito difícil, não foi um debate assim tão difícil, porque a gente já tinha um currículo plural desde da década de 80. Acho que por conta do Paulo Freire ser um dos intelectuais importantes na educação, a gente já tinha um currículo plural, certo? Então, isso é muito importante, né? Essa resolução, essa lógica. Então, é interessante, os princípios básicos, isso é o que está escrito na lei, certo? Que é resultado dos nossos debates. Então, o curso de economia no Brasil é regulado pelo Estado, como todos os cursos, mas a regulação veio do debate, todas as vezes veio do debate entre os economistas, nesse nível que eu expliquei, profissionais, acadêmicos. Então, é comprometimento com o estudo da realidade brasileira, sem prejuízo de uma sólida formação teórica, histórica e instrumental. Pluralismo metodológico, em coerência com o caráter plural das ciências econômicas, formadas por correntes de pensamento e paradigmas diversos. ênfase nas inter-relações e fenômenos econômicos com o todo social em que se insere. ênfase na formação de atitudes do bom senso ético, do senso ético, repito, apesar de que eu tropecei a primeira vez, para exercício profissional e para a responsabilidade social indispensáveis ao exercício da profissão. Nesses 4 pontos, eu acho que a gente conseguiu resumir, de uma certa forma, em lei, a preocupação que o Andrew nos traz, que hoje assola a Europa no debate sobre o pluralismo. Depois eu vou terminar e falar dos problemas, óbvio que nós temos problemas. Perfil desejado do formando. Desculpa a plateia, eu preciso ler porque eu não fiz os slides em inglês, então o Andrew não consegue entender se eu não ler os slides, né? Então, perfil do formando. Quem é o profissional que nós estamos formando? Aspectos específicos. Capacidade de compreender questões científicas, técnicas, sociais e políticas relacionadas com a economia. Sólida consciência social, indispensável ao enfrentamento de situações emergentes na sociedade politicamente organizada. Capacidade de interagir e opinar diante das transformações político-econômicas e sociais contextualizadas na sociedade brasileira e na economia mundial. Sólida formação geral e com domínio técnico dos estudos relacionados com a formação teórico-quantitativa e teórico-prática. Visão histórica do pensamento econômico aplicado à realidade brasileira e ao contexto mundial. Aspectos gerais do formando. Ampla base cultural, capacidade de tomar decisões e encontrar soluções para problemas em uma realidade complexa e em constante transformação, capacidade analítica e visão crítica, competência para adquirir novos conhecimentos e repensar os paradigmas teóricos. Os paradigmas teóricos, do pluralismo teórico, são as diferentes visões. Domínio das habilidades relativas à efetiva comunicação e expressão oral e escrita. Ou seja, um dos elementos que os empresários, que os empregadores pedem são habilidades, né? Habilidades de comunicação e expressão oral. É um item lá que está lá em cima. Segundo ponto importante, capacidade de resolver problemas complexos. Certo? Capacidade de resolver problemas complexos. Isso nós não tiramos do nada, Andrew. Isso daí foi anos e anos de congressos da nossa associação. Nós trazíamos headhunters para saber o que os headhunters queriam. Porque muitas vezes os alunos não sabem o que querem, mas os empregadores, que são quem contrata os profissionais, sabem exatamente o que querem. Então foi daí que se tirou isso. Competências e habilidades do formando. Desenvolver raciocínios logicamente consistentes, ler e compreender textos econômicos, elaborar pareceres, relatórios, análises, trabalhos e textos na área econômica, utilizar adequadamente conceitos teóricos presentes, de novo, mais uma vez, nos diversos paradigmas ou formas de pensar a economia fundamentais da ciência econômica, ou seja, pensamento neoclássico, novo keynesiano, pós-keynesiano, marxista e etc. Utilizar o instrumental econômico e o conhecimento histórico para analisar situações históricas concretas. Utilizar formulações matemáticas e estatísticas na análise de fenômenos socioeconômicos. Diferenciar correntes teóricas presentes nas distintas políticas econômicas. Andrew, eu acho que eu não podia fazer um melhor comentário à sua fala, à sua palestra, do que mostrar exatamente como a gente concorda com os pontos que você levanta. Exatamente como a gente trabalha essas questões há muitos anos e como a gente, nos nossos debates internos, chegou a esse texto final, vamos dizer assim. Isso eu vou pular, porque não é importante. O nosso curso tem 3.000 horas, tá? Integralização em 4 anos, no mínimo. Tá? Então, isso é um detalhe só, para a gente ter uma ideia do tamanho do nosso curso. Conteúdos curriculares, como é que a gente faz, né? Aquilo era o que a gente quer fazer, não é isso? O que os currículos devem fazer. Que profissionais que a gente quer formar. Profissionais, não é? Isso é graduação, isso não é pós-graduação. Conteúdos que revelem interrelações com a realidade nacional e internacional, segundo uma perspectiva histórica e contextualizada dos diferentes fenômenos relacionados com a economia, utilizando tecnologias inovadoras. Esse é o nosso, deverão os conteúdos, né? A gente tem esses conteúdos que eu vou falar detalhadamente, só rapidamente. Conteúdos de formação geral. São 3 blocos, só para a gente entender. Eu só vou falar dos 3 blocos. Formação geral. 6.2, formação teórico-quantitativa. 6.3, formação histórica, teórico-prática. A formação livre é menos importante. Unidades ou disciplinas. Então, conteúdos de formação geral. Tem que ter na grade horária, no introdução à economia, que é a introdução ao curso, cada curso tem o seu perfil, né? Ciências sociais e ciências políticas, filosofia, ética, administração, direito, contabilidade, matemática e estatística. Esses são conteúdos que precisam obrigatoriamente estarem contemplados em 10% da carga horária mínima. 10%, mais ou menos de 3.000 horas, 300 horas. Conteúdos de formação teórico-quantitativa. Claro, formação teórico-quantitativa para nós, já descrito anteriormente, teoria é algo que tem que explicar a realidade concreta e ajudar a entender a realidade concreta. Senão, não serve, mesmo que seja para entender o debate, que está na realidade concreta. O debate entre os paradigmas. Contabilidade social, microeconomia, macroeconomia, economia política. Microeconomia hoje é mais ou menos mainstream. Macroeconomia, também concordo com você que não são separados, foi uma separação que foi feita a posteriori, mas é difícil desfazer essa... O Keynes escreveu Teoria Geral, Marx escreveu O Capital, Smith escreveu A Riqueza das Nações, e assim, Marshall escreveu Princípios de Economia, se bem que era um livro de microeconomia. O Marshall já era um livro de microeconomia. Certo? Macroeconomia, economia política, que é basicamente economia marxista, é obrigatório estar no currículo. Economia, daí as derivações, que misturam a base paradigmática que estão dentro das disciplinas anteriores. Qual é a base paradigmática? Nós consideramos 3 grandes paradigmas. O paradigma Keynes, pós-keynesiano, que está dentro da macroeconomia. O paradigma marxista, que está dentro da economia política. E o paradigma neoclássico, que está mais afeto à microeconomia. Mas que depois se espalham e se confundem na disciplina de economia internacional, economia do setor público, economia setor público do Estado, economia monetária, que daí tem partes da economia do marxismo, partes da macroeconomia pós-keynesiana ou etc. A financiarização aparece aí. Desenvolvimento socioeconômico, ou teoria do desenvolvimento econômico, estatística econômica e econometria, que são instrumentais, disciplinas instrumentais. Para estes conteúdos, o currículo deve observar 20% de carga horária mínima do total de 3.000 horas, que são 600 horas. Certo? Nós recomendamos, no mínimo, 60 horas por unidade nesse contexto, né? A ANGE recomenda. Unidades de formação histórica. A gente tem um bloco de 10%, 300 horas mínimas, para a formação histórica, que é História Econômica Geral, que conta toda a Constituição, o economista estuda capitalismo, né? Toda a Constituição do capitalismo é o que nós estudamos. A formação econômica do Brasil, ou seja, a questão do Brasil, a economia brasileira contemporânea, e História do Pensamento Econômico. História do Pensamento Econômico como uma disciplina obrigatória, né? Nós também recomendamos no mínimo 60 horas, para entender e para fazer a relação entre os paradigmas. Essa é a função da história do pensamento econômico, é reconstituir ontológica e historicamente como é que os paradigmas neoclássico, que hoje agrega novos keynesianos e novos clássicos, pós-keynesianos, que agrega o keynesianismo originário, vamos dizer assim, o Keynes original e os pós-keynesianos e os marxistas. Também 10% do nosso curso tem que estar nessa carga horária. Isso é o currículo brasileiro, isso é que estrutura o currículo brasileiro. Dentro de que princípio? Dentro exatamente da ideia de que nós temos que... Deixa eu só, eu tenho que ler aqui para vocês ainda. Que nós temos... a discussão é a discussão do que formar, que é a nossa discussão da lei. Que economista que a gente forma. A base é descrita no nosso próprio currículo, é formar economistas com capacidade crítica de entender a complexidade do funcionamento da economia. E só é possível entender a complexidade da economia com um ensino plural. A nossa proposta, o que a gente faz como pluralismo é o que está, mais ou menos, o que eu mais ou menos expulso. Então é um ensino plural com essa capacidade e competência. É claro que isso não é ensinar a economia como a alocação de recursos escassos, não é se focar exclusivamente no individualismo metodológico, não é fazer estas coisas. É considerar os paradigmas no sentido kuhniano, de Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, no sentido kuhniano do que vem a ser. Paradigma é constituído por diferentes métodos, diferentes bases axiomáticas e diferentes instrumentais. São paradigmas que são paradigmas concorrentes, que estão permanentemente em debate e que precisam ser contemplados. O que aconteceu, o que acontece na nossa história, obviamente? Na década de 90, a gente teve muitos problemas, não com esse currículo foi aprovado em 2007. Na década de 90, nós tivemos muitos problemas com o que aconteceu com o mundo. Foi muito interessante. Para nós, a invasão de estudantes que foram para o exterior estudar o pensamento único e que voltaram para as nossas universidades como professores, imbuídos de uma ideia de que não existia mais debate teórico, que não existia mais nenhum problema na teoria a ser resolvido, que o único objetivo do economista era organizar números e dados para entender movimentos entre variáveis, em modelos econométricos pré-determinados e pré-definidos, nos quais não se discutia nem mais a teoria. A gente tem cursos que, como na Europa, não se discute teoria, não existe teoria, existe uma forma de pensar única, que a gente chama de pensamento único. Inclusive, esses economistas dizem assim: nós somos economistas, vocês não são, vocês são políticos, vocês são, né? Isso tem essa lógica. Claro, esse processo que aconteceu no mundo, que a gente tinha uma ligação mais próxima com a Europa desde a década de 80, o nosso currículo era mais próximo do currículo europeu da década de 80, certo? A década na verdade, de 70, que era muito mais plural, né? Na França, por exemplo, o livro de entrada no mestrado era o Henri Denis, História do Pensamento Econômico. Esse era o livro que os estudantes tinham que estudar para ingressar no mestrado e PhD francês. Isso desapareceu da Europa, isso desapareceu da França. Nós continuamos adotando pedaços, ou agora tem o Discrepante, tem outros livros mais interessantes em história do pensamento econômico. Ou não, na verdade, enquanto instituição, enquanto ANGE, nós defendemos que os originais sejam lidos e nunca manuais. Nunca livros-textos, porque livros-textos têm o viés de fazer o quê? De dizer para o aluno que aquilo é uma verdade e não fazer o aluno compreender como é que se chegou naquele resultado. Isso é a importância de não usar manuais. Quando se lê o Keynes é obrigado, apesar de que ele explica mal, mas ele é obrigado a explicar as suas conclusões. Quando a gente lê o Smith, ele é obrigado a explicar e, logicamente, nos convencer das suas conclusões. O Marshall faz isso, os clássicos fazem isso. Os manuais não têm essa função. Os manuais têm a função exclusivamente de dizer: esta é a verdade, aprenda, estude, que isso é o que vai cair na sua prova. Isso impede o pensamento crítico, obviamente, porque você não formula a lógica, você simplesmente parte do resultado, decora o resultado e vem para a prova colocar o resultado que você fará bem. Então, o pensamento crítico passa pela leitura dos originais. Passa pelo retorno à leitura dos originais. na nossa concepção de formação. Certo? Ou seja, estes conteúdos devem partir dos originais. Esse aqui é importante. E um pouco me preocupa quando a gente fala de cases, ou partir de casos concretos. O mainstream está repleto de respostas para problemas. Esse é o problema de trabalhar com casos. Que você abre o manual e você tem: subiram os preços, solução, subir a taxa de juros. Caíram os preços, solução, diminuir a taxa de juros. Subiram os preços, subir a taxa de juros, cortar o gasto público, flexibilizar a câmbio e vai por aí afora, né? Tem um menu de soluções. Então, quando a gente trabalha muito sobre cases em economia, muitas vezes a gente não chega, os economistas no Brasil, o mainstream tem trabalhado sobre cases desta forma. Inclusive tem um jogo na GV que o COFECOM participa muitas vezes. A gente tem um jogo criado por um professor que foi professor da minha universidade, o Paulo Sandrone, que é um jogo de solução de problemas. É uma sociedade, é um jogo muito bacana, é uma sociedade, mas que quem segue o manual ao pé da letra é o melhor presidente daquela sociedade fictícia elaborada no jogo. Não tem problemas complexos. As soluções são dadas pelos manuais. Então é muito perigoso a gente falar em cases, né? Nós não optamos por cases, nós optamos por realidade concreta. Isso sim, falar da realidade concreta, né? Isso é o ponto central. Nunca afastarmos-nos da realidade concreta. Então, isso é importante. O pluralismo está no nosso currículo, o pluralismo está na nossa discussão. É muito importante você vir para cá para dizer isso, para dizer que esta que é uma preocupação nossa de 20 anos, de 30 anos, é uma preocupação que hoje assola os economistas da Europa. Isso é fundamental para nós entendermos o que nós estamos fazendo e o que nós fizemos. Eu sou particularmente coordenador do curso e professor eu não gosto de dizer isso, às vezes eu não sou mais presidente da ANJA, agora eu posso dizer, maior curso de economia do país, quiçá da América Latina, meu curso, nós temos Keynes no original, um semestre inteiro. Nós temos Marx no original, 3 semestres. Nós temos microeconomia, 3 microeconomias, macroeconomia, tudo mainstream também. Currículo completamente plural, no sentido de professores mais assim, mais assado. Curso de 4 anos e meio, caro, pago, não é curso público. E nossos estudantes estão todos no final do curso. Nós tem 300 ingressantes e 270, 260 formandos. Abandono praticamente muito baixo do nosso abandono. Eu fiquei sabendo que nós formamos mais economista do que todo o curso de economia em Santa Catarina. Santa Catarina forma menos economista que a gente na PUC, que a gente na minha universidade. E eles vão trabalhar todos, 99% dos que querem estar empregados estão trabalhando. Em São Paulo, estão trabalhando. Aonde que eles trabalham? 75% em bancos e empresas de consultoria. O resto em empresas produtivas e etc. A formação plural é para o mercado de trabalho. O problema que nós temos com a nossa formação não é com o mercado de trabalho. No mercado de trabalho, incrivelmente, esta formação plural é muito bem aceita, porque formamos alunos para resolver problemas complexos e para pensar a complexidade. Aqui os conselhos sabem disso, que o problema, o mercado de trabalho quer este profissional. O nosso problema, por incrível que pareça, é com a academia, com os pós-graduação, com os cursos de mestrado e com os cursos de doutorado, PhD. onde o mainstream dos professores que foram para o exterior, que foram para os Estados Unidos e que voltaram para o Brasil, é aplicado em parte significativa dos nossos pós-graduação. O exame de ingresso no curso de pós-graduação, para todos os cursos nacionais, todos têm que fazer o mesmo exame de ingresso no pós-graduação, é um exame mainstream. Existe um conflito entre a academia e o mercado. Essa que é a coisa mais esdrúxula dessa discussão. Que o mainstream, os pós-graduação, querem um sujeito matemático, modelar e etc. E o mercado quer um sujeito capaz de pensar a complexidade. Portanto, uma formação plural proporciona isso a ele. Então, eu encerro a minha fala para não tomar muito mais tempo, mas isso é extremamente importante, mais uma vez, para a gente olhar, nós no Brasil, olharmos para nós mesmos e vermos o que nós fizemos e o que nós estamos fazendo. E qual é a nossa batalha e qual é a nossa luta. Isso é que é o mais importante de tudo isso, de trazer pessoas como o Andrew para nos brindar com a preocupação que eles têm na Europa, que se conjuga com a nossa luta aqui no Brasil. Obrigado.
Bom, eu estou aqui num papel muito simpático de ter que acelerar, porque nós temos um horário aqui de funcionamento do banco. Então, eu gostaria de sugestões, como a gente pode encaminhar. Talvez o Andrew queira comentar um pouco a fala, ou passamos a palavra para a plateia, para perguntas. Mas nós temos realmente um tempo restrito aqui, talvez no máximo mais uns 10 minutos. Então, vocês têm alguma sugestão? Okay. Tá certo. Estou recebendo aqui uma sugestão que pedir aos dois que façam uma fala de encerramento, uma fala curta, e as questões da plateia nós tentarmos encaminhar por e-mail para os comentários dos palestrantes. Pode ser assim? Então, quem gostaria de começar? Por favor, professor Andrew.
It's easy. Okay. Yeah. You finish and you have more time. Oh, wow.
Bom, eu rapidamente, eu acho que eu acabei de falar e de uma certa forma na minha própria fala eu já finalizei o que eu acho que é importante. Eu acho que é importante dessa coisa toda, só pontuando, a gente entender a importância do pluralismo. O que significa o pluralismo? O pluralismo significa abordar diferentes correntes teóricas. O pluralismo significa abordar diferentes metodologias. Essas diferentes correntes teóricas, essas metodologias, estas diferentes formas de pensar só enriquecem a formação do economista porque ajuda a pensar a complexidade. O problema do pensamento único é acreditar que a economia não é complexa, é acreditar que tudo pode ser simplificado e resolvido por modelos, é acreditar que a economia é movida por leis como a física, o equilíbrio geral, como o Andrew citou, acreditar nestes que são crenças que não se comprovam na realidade, e impedir politicamente, por interesses políticos, o debate contundente sobre a realidade concreta. O debate sobre a realidade concreta é a nossa função enquanto economista. Nós, na década de 50, tínhamos um papel central porque era este o nosso papel. debater a realidade concreta e encontrar soluções para problemas complexos. A gente sabia que a economia funcionava de forma complexa. Não é ficar fazendo modelos seguindo economia como leis da natureza. E isso está na formação plural. Formação plural significa, sim, eu vou só pontuar, os novoclássicos têm este nome, Lucas Sargent. Lucas é famoso por uma frase do Wall Street Journal. Ele disse, em 2007, crise? Que crise? Nós estamos cansados, já conhecemos economia o suficiente para saber que não há crise alguma, que tudo se resolverá rapidamente, não tem nenhuma crise de subprime, nada, isso é pontual. Lucas, o pai, um dos pais, né, do pensamento novoclássico, que faço questão, novoclássico, porque é o retorno ao pensamento que Keynes denominava clássico do século XIX, baseado numa sofisticação do pensamento marginalista. Jevons, Menger, Walras. Sofisticação que não era nem o retorno a Marshall, que era mais interessante do que o pensamento clássico, que Keynes denomina clássico, que é do século XIX. Eles voltaram, teoria quantitativa da moeda, market clearing num ciclo de negócios dinâmico, num equilíbrio dinâmico, mercado de trabalho sendo definido pelo nível de salário, eram os três elementos que o Keynes questiona no Teoria Geral. Eram os três elementos que já estavam no Capital de Marx no século XIX, questionando o pensamento clássico. E nós voltamos ao século XIX, chamando esta teoria de moderna. E pensamento único. Colocaram os novos keynesianos nessa história porque tem rigidez, daí a rigidez de preço e salário. De novo, justamente o que Keynes dizia, rigidez de salários não define emprego. Está no Teoria Geral. Não, esqueceram, voltamos aos clássicos, ao debate que o Keynes fez na década de 30. Portanto, gente, não é uma questão de ir ou voltar, é uma questão do que explica melhor a realidade concreta, no que nos dá elementos para entender essa realidade concreta. Isso, é por isso que o pluralismo metodológico é fundamental, por isso que a abordagem dos paradigmas é fundamental. Obrigado.
Thank you. Well, I did say that I wanted to come here and learn, and I can safely say that I have. And what I learnt is pleasing. Clearly, as you've demonstrated, all the things that I'm arguing for that ought to happen in the UK, in the US, and other parts of Europe, you have them. So that's great, as well as good weather. It's everything. I suppose I have some questions in terms of the courses that you showed there. My only concern about some of those is that they possibly appear as separate blocks. And it's possible, you say we've got a mainstream micro, and then we have a political economy course over here. I have some concerns about that, in that you could get sort of ghettos of ideas over here. Well, that's the mainstream corner, and that's the post-Keynesian corner, etc. And I guess that within the program you do have the potential for debates. I personally prefer where you actually force the students. I'm sure this happens sometimes, but I'm sure you do this. But where you actually force them to debate perspectives on a particular question, and there's no chance of ghettos emerging. I think that's my only reservation I have about what you showed us, but maybe that's already taken into consideration. The other thing I would say is, well, two other things. One, it's very interesting, we talked about this before the event, the role of a professional body in cementing this, and actually that professional body has taken a pluralist position, and that's hugely significant, because whenever the UK equivalent, the Royal Economic Society, talks about should we take a position, should we endorse particular courses or particular people, I always say, no, we don't want them to do that, because we know what the outcome would be, because it would be very, very much dominated by mainstream. So all of these arguments about how to deliver pluralism are contingent on there being people in place that want to do it that way, and also are able to do it that way. So if you've got a governing body, a professional body that says this is how we want it, then that's great. Obviously, what happens if that changes? And so the only concern I had, well, I guess two related concerns. You said that the graduate programs were much more mainstream. I thought you did.
The
Postgraduate?
Yeah.
Okay, so the master's programs, PhD programs, they're much more mainstream. Okay, so who's going to teach those people?
Yeah.
It's the people who are doing mainstream research. And that mainstream research is very much driven by a few universities in the United States, and they're not showing any signs of becoming more pluralistic. So there's a potential for a dynamic to happen there that leads this pluralist situation you have changing and becoming much less pluralist, particularly if you accept that there's a link between the economics curriculum and the politics. And that, we're, in the UK, US, and other places, very much more clearly sort of neoliberal. In Brazil, well, we're not really sure. Now, if that changes, and it can change. I mean, let's not forget that in the UK, we weren't neoliberal 40 years ago. We were very much not that. And the neoliberals were the ones who were regarded as crazy. But now they're the ones in charge. And UK curricula used to look much more like what you described as what is a Brazilian curriculum. So something changed. And it's all of these different factors about the politics and the dynamics of the discipline. And these things can change. So while I'm really pleased about what you showed me and what I wish I'd read earlier, I'm also, I guess without wanting to be a scaremonger, these things can alter and they need to be protected. And what you've got, which seems to be preciously pluralist, could be under threat because of these wider dynamics within the discipline and outside the discipline. So that would be my comment. But thank you very much for sharing the details of that. And rather than me being invited here to talk to you about curriculum, you should be invited to the UK and talk about the Brazil curriculum and say this is what you should do. So let's see if we can do that. Thank you.
Muito rapidamente, I would like to answer the question. Rapidamente. Blocos de disciplinas. Há uma dificuldade grande de desfazer os blocos de disciplinas, é verdade. Mas dentro dos blocos de disciplinas, na verdade, as diferentes visões ela aparece. Dificuldade, sim. Dos blocos de disciplinas, macroeconomia, microeconomia, elas aparecem essas dificuldades. E a dificuldade maior é com a formação dos professores de verdade, porque eu preciso de professores que tenham uma visão plural e que, nos seus blocos de disciplinas, façam isso. Agora, politicamente, nós nunca conseguimos dissolver blocos de disciplinas, politicamente. No currículo anterior, da década de 80, a gente dizia o pluralismo está dentro de cada bloco de disciplina. E o pluralismo não estava dentro de cada bloco de disciplina. Então é mais fácil você implantar o pluralismo mantendo as disciplinas com diferentes approaches, com diferentes contextos, do que você querer que dentro da macro... Então é mais fácil você ter uma macroeconomia 1, que é Keynes, teoria geral no original, e uma macroeconomia 2, que é Keynesian, Orthodox Keynesian, ISLM, e uma macroeconomia 3, que é novoclássica. É muito mais fácil você ter essa separação do que você juntar tudo e achar que alguém vai ser capaz de fazer tudo junto. Nós temos duas disciplinas fundantes para juntar tudo isso. Uma é a introdução à economia, que tem a função de expor que a economia tem essas características, e a outra disciplina é a história do pensamento econômico, que vai fazer a amarração, o debate entre os paradigmas. E os alunos vão estar aptos a fazer o debate entre os paradigmas. São essas duas disciplinas que fazem isso. O pós-graduação é, de fato, o nosso maior problema. É o maior problema mas é recente, é engraçado, é invertido. Porque a gente tinha até a década de 90, o nosso pós-graduação era plural. Eu mesmo, quando fiz o exame para ingresso no pós-graduação, caía Keynes no original, caía Kaletsky no original, não caía Marx também, isso é querer muito. Mas caíam esses autores heterodoxos. Hoje em dia não cai mais. Então, os professores foram cada vez mais se tornando ortodoxos, mas é um momento recente, que foi interessante. Quando os jovens porque hoje os ortodoxos são jovens, não são os velhos. Eu já estou na fase dos velhos. Os jovens é que são ortodoxos, que estão ocupando o lugar dos velhos. E daí o que acontece? Mas veio a crise, veio o debate, e é uma luta. Está permanentemente, 20 anos de militância, 28 anos de ANGE, nós estamos permanentemente em debate. E é gostoso.
Quero agradecer aos dois professores e passar para o cerimonial, o encerramento.
Antes de darmos por encerrado, o presidente do Corecon vai falar uma homenagem ao professor Andrew John Merman. Professor Andrew. Se eu quiser tirar, só
É cachaça aí, pão de queijo, goiabada cascão.
E também homenageará o professor Rubens Rogério Savaia. Gostaríamos ainda de lembrar a todos da pequena alteração no programa na parte da manhã, do dia de amanhã. Às 9h30, então, o presidente do COFECON e os demais presidentes dos conselhos regionais farão um debate sobre o projeto de lei, e às 11 horas terá palestra do ministro, que faria às 9h30, por questões de agenda pessoal. Então, em nome do Corecon Minas Gerais e dos apoiadores deste encontro, agradecemos mais uma vez a todos pela presença, aguardamos por vocês amanhã, então, nos horários já anunciados, e agora convidamos para um coquetel de confraternização que será realizado no foyer deste auditório. A todos uma boa noite.